Hello, everyone. This week we are going to be talking through the important topics of culture and identity. I believe that these concepts are going to be critical in providing a foundation for us as we continue on in the different topics that we have for this semester. So I hope that this will provide a good foundation for you to frame the course material as they come up. So I wanted to first start off by saying that, especially when we have had conversations around culture, race, and identity in this day and age, these are often very emotionally, politically charged topics. So I understand that. And my hope is that through this class, you will have a forum to be able to learn from one another, but also to be able to ask questions and to be able to challenge your own ideas as well. Now, I will say that everyone will have different opinions regarding different issues, including myself. And I will try to be very open about where I stand. At the same time, I want to be clear that I do not expect you to all agree with me either. Everyone will have their different opinions and different reasons why they've come to those opinions. And I want to make sure that we have an understanding that that's the case. And I understand as the instructor that you may have different opinions as myself, and that is fine as well. I want to also say that you will definitely not be penalized for disagreeing with me or having a different opinion than I have, especially when it comes with your grades. So please rest easy in knowing that the way that I evaluate your work is based on how you back up your opinions, not about the actual opinions that you have. Okay, so with that, I wanted to start this course material and just giving you some foundation on what culture is, and then I'll talk more about different aspects of racial and ethnic identity development and what we might be able to expect in terms of how people develop and how children actually develop those identities over time. So, what is culture? Now, culture, there are different definitions out there as to what culture is exactly. But the definition that I'm going to use for this class is from Hein 2020, and that is culture is a dynamic group of people who share a similar context, are exposed to many similar cultural messages, and contain a broad range of different individuals who are affected by those cultural message in various ways. Let me break down that definition for you. So let's first talk through this idea that culture involves being exposed to similar cultural messages. Culture is basically any kind of information that is acquired from other members of one's species, in this case, the human species. And oftentimes this information is learned through social interactions, right? And that in turn affects our behaviors. Now, information, cultural information in particular, can be any kind of idea, belief, technology, habit, practice that's acquired through social learning. The second piece that I want to draw your attention to is this idea that this culture involves a dynamic group of people. Culture is hard to have without people, right? In fact, culture involves groups of people who exist with some kind of shared context, right? They might be shared ideas. It might be through attending similar cultural organizations. It might be through engaging in similar cultural practices. They might be through seeing the same advertisements. It might be through following the same cultural norms. It might be just through daily conversations that they have with each other. Okay, so it involves groups of people that share something. And oftentimes they share similar informations, Okay. Now, the third part I want to draw your attention to is that it includes a broad range of different individuals who are affected by these messages in different ways. And the reason why this is important to note is that culture does not mean that everyone who belongs to that culture will act the same way. It just means that on average, you'll find that people tend towards certain patterns of behavior. Does not mean that every person will, but on average they may. But it's also important to understand that there is individual variation even within culture. So let me give you an example of culture. Let's think about Korean culture, since I've mentioned earlier in this semester that I'm Korean. I feel that I can speak to some aspects of Korean culture as well. So in Korean culture, one of the values that we have is to respect the elderly. Some of you in your own cultures may also feel like you can relate to that value. And that's the cultural message that has been passed down to me through my parents in how they interact with elderly people, through just different practices that I see, whether it's bowing out of respect for the elderly when you see them, but also in our language, right? In the way that we speak to elderly and use honorifics and even use formal language. This all surrounds the cultural message that elderly are to be respected and honored in Korean culture. So, um, you know, those are some commonalities that we might have as Koreans, but just because you're Korean doesn't mean that automatically you're going to be speaking in formal language. Do you see what I mean? There are individual differences in how that message of value is, taken in, and then, how that is actually, demonstrated and manifested in different individuals within Korean culture. Okay, so some people will use honorifics to all elderly. Some people won't use honorifics or formal language to certain elderly. Some people won't use it at all. You'll have some individual differences. However, on average, because of the similar cultural messages that Korean people may have received, you will see that there is a general sense of respect for elderly, and oftentimes you'll see that even through our language. So how does culture relate to identity? Well, according to Marcus and Moya, they have this wonderful model here that you see in this slide, and you can see that we have three aspects. We have our social environment, that includes things like culture, and then we have our identity, then we have our behavior. Now, our environment oftentimes affects the way that we build our own sense of identity, because identity actually includes the intersection between how we view ourselves and how we feel other people view us. Okay, and that intersection between how we see ourselves and how other people view us is what Marcus and Moya believe makes up our identity. And identity is important because identity oftentimes also influences how we think, how we feel, and how we act, right? So again, thinking about that identity that I mentioned as a Korean person or even a Korean American person, some of that has been informed by how I view myself, but how other people have also shown that they view me, right? Through different comments that they make, right? Oh, you know, what's that you're eating, right? That's kimchi, which is fermented spicy, cabbage, the one of the most delicious, foods in Korean cuisine, but not the only one. And so through comments like that, I realized, oh, I guess this is part of who I am, the type of food that I eat, right? Or even, feedback they give about me bowing to elders, like, oh, that's very respectful of you, right? And so I build my sense of identity based off of my own view of self, but also the feedback and the influence that other people have on my identity through reinforcement, whether that's positive or negative. Okay, and that affects my behavior. Depending on your identity, who you see yourself as, oftentimes it also dictates what we spend our time with, right? What we spend our time on and how we spend that time. So, for example, as a Korean person, because I see that as an important part of who I am, I might spend time learning my language or learning about my ancestry or learning more about how I can respect other people, right? Those are just some examples of how this model might work. So let's talk more about this identity piece. I want to talk specifically about race and ethnicity, racial and ethnic identity. Now, oftentimes when people talk about these two terms, you might have seen those two terms be used interchangeably. However, through this class, I hope that you learn that they're actually different. Okay, these concepts are very different, even though they have some similarities. So let me talk you through some of the similarities first, and then I'll talk you through how they might be different. So, race and ethnicity are similar in that both of them have to do with being dynamic. What that means is that they can change over time. Okay, they're both similar in that they're historically derived. Okay, they have been just established over time. Okay, and they are institutionalized. What that means is that race and ethnicity is not just about the individual, but also this involves how institutions, larger forces, organizations, practices, laws have actually established and changed and formed race and ethnicity. Okay, so in those ways they're similar. However, they're different in the following ways. Race is about how certain ethnic groups are perceived physically and behaviorally by other people. So you may have heard that phrase, race is a social construct, and that's where that phrase comes from, is the idea that race oftentimes is determined by how people perceive you, specifically your physical and behavioral characteristics. Whereas ethnicity is more about how you identify yourself or how other people identify you based on commonalities. Okay, and these commonalities might be language, history, religion, customs, physical appearance, genealogy, practices, ancestry, etc. The second way that race and ethnicity are different is that race often associates different amounts of value, power, and privilege with these characteristics, physical or behavioral human characteristics, and establishes a social status ranking among the different groups. So depending on what race you are, there might be different amount of value, power, and privilege ascribed to that particular race. Okay, and this is what happens when it's socially constructed, based off of human perception. Whereas for ethnicity, ethnicity can be a source of meaning, action, and identity. And then finally, the third way that race and ethnicity are different is that race often emerges when certain groups of people are perceived as a potential threat, right, to another group's worldview or way of life. And sometimes, in the worst case scenarios, race has sometimes been used to justify prejudice towards other people, right? Whereas ethnicity oftentimes is a way that confers a sense of belonging, pride, and motivation. So just to kind of clear up these differences between race and ethnicity, racially, I would consider myself and other people would likely see me as an Asian person, right? Based off of my perceived physical and behavioral characteristics, the color of my hair, my facial structure, and even the way that I act, perhaps. But my ethnicity is Korean American because that's how I identify myself in terms of my language, my history, my customs, right, of my people. Now, race Asian, ethnicity Korean American. And some of the differences being as an Asian person, right, race, it's often associated with different amounts of power, privilege, and value, right? In some ways, as an Asian person, there are some privileges that I experience that other groups of people in different other races don't have that same privilege, right, or power. I don't have to fear for my life when I'm going on a run, right? I can count on, finding, more Asian people in Marina, right? I can also, count on people not questioning my academic ability because of certain stereotypes, right? So there's some privilege and power associated with being Asian. At the same time, there's also some non privileges and lack of power that's also associated with being Asian, right? And these are those stereotypes that are also lies about Asian people are quiet or they don't make good leaders, right? And or they don't know how to speak English, right? So these are negative stereotypes that are not true about certain groups of people based on their race. Okay, but as you can see, whether it is, that amount of privilege that you have, or even the stereotypes associated with your particular race, oftentimes these have been used in our history and even in current times to put different rankings, right, on different groups, and ascribe different values on different groups, and sometimes even been used to, have prejudice towards certain groups of races. So that's a little bit about talking about race. In terms of ethnicity, on the other hand, as a Korean American, I definitely have learned to have a sense of belonging and pride to my people. So, with that, I want to be able to talk through how do individuals actually develop in their ethnic identity. So, one of the prominent theorists around ethnic identity formation is actually Finney. And Finney believed that ethnic identity happens in four stages. And these four stages depend on how much you've explored your ethnic identity and how committed you are to that ethnic identity. Now, if you're part of the majority, for example, American culture, ethnic identity formation tends not to be a primary concern um, right away, maybe later on. Okay, but for many in minority groups, race or ethnicity is central to identity formation because we have situations that come up that almost force us to work through our ethnic identity. But even with all of that, whether you're part of the majority culture or ethnic minority culture, ethnic identity formation is relevant. Everyone goes through it at some point, and it's very important to go through it healthily, right? For other later outcomes. So with that, I want to talk through the four stages. And in the first stage of identity diffusion basically is when there is no commitment. So the commitment is absent, and also exploration is also absent. So, for example, Juanita, she may have done little or no exploration of her ethnicity as a Latina, and she might not see yet the issues that may be involved with her ethnic identity in the context of living in the US, for example. Then there is identity foreclosure, which is when you are committed to that ethnic identity, but have not yet had a crisis or a way to explore that identity. So Caleb may have done little or no exploration of his ethnicity, but has clear feelings about it. He's proud, right? And these feelings may be positive or negative depending on the attitudes that he has absorbed at home. Then there is moratorium, which is when you have a crisis that forces you to explore. So the exploration is present, but no commitment yet, right? And so Chosan has begun to explore her ethnicity, but is confused about what it means to her. Okay, at the same time, she has an opportunity now to explore what that might mean, right? Through a situation or conflict that has brought her ethnic identity to the forefront. And then finally, there's ethnic identity achievement, where the individual has experienced a crisis and has committed to their ethnic identity. And so Diego may have explored his identity and understands and accepts and values his ethnic identity. And in this model, again, it's each stage is basically characterized by your level of commitment, but also your level of exploration. And ideally, obviously, you would be able to go through to achieve your identity achievement stage. Now, I just want to note though that these stages are, people can go through these different stages multiple times and at different points in their lives. It doesn't mean just because you've gone through to identity achievement once, you won't experience identity diffusion or foreclosure in a different instant. Okay, so it's a little bit more complex, but it does give us language to understand how identity formation might happen, specifically as it relates to ethnicity. So ethnic identity is complicated because oftentimes when you live in a multicultural environment, you are talking about multiple cultures colliding with each other. So acculturation is actually that process of cultural and psychological change that happens when two or more cultures meet, right? When they interact with each other. So, a classic example of this would be for my parents. When they immigrated from South Korea to the US, they now had to navigate being a Korean person in an American culture. And so they've had to navigate the meeting of the Korean and American cultures. And that process is called acculturation. Now, as you can imagine, juggling and navigating the blending and integration and the meeting of two different cultures can be a very stressful process, right? Very complicated process. And so there has been lots of studies that have shown the amount of stress that, for example, immigrants or international students have experienced because they're having to juggle multiple identities, multiple cultures. And so what I want to talk through is I wanted to give you some language behind how acculturation might look for certain people, right? And so in this particular graph, you see that there is on the y-axis the host society. That's the majority culture, and then the society of origin, that's where the culture that is your home culture. And so there are actually different ways that people actually integrate their cultures. Some people, they accept their society of origin, their home culture. So in the example of my parents, they might very well have accepted their Korean culture, but they have not accepted their host American culture. So you might see that play out, that separation actually play out in, who they hang out with, right? And so those in the separation acculturation style might only hang out, for example, with people of their same ethnicity, right? Then there is the marginalization group that has neither integrated their home culture or their majority culture. So that would be, so like in my parents' case, if they didn't feel like they belonged in their Korean culture and also didn't feel that they belonged in their American culture, that would be called marginalization. You just feel like you don't belong anywhere. Then there is assimilation, where you might have completely rejected your home culture but embraced the American culture, right? And so that would be in the case of my parents if they had decided, for example, we're not going to speak any Korean at home and only English because we want to make sure that you learn the language. That would be an example of assimilation. And then finally, integration is when you both accept your home culture and the majority culture. And this is, for example, for my parents, if they decided to celebrate and keep and learn and maintain their Korean culture, but also learn the American culture as well. And so research actually shows that there is a most ideal type of acculturation. And based off of research, the integration style of acculturation, where you are bicultural, where you're able to tap into your home culture but also the majority culture, is associated with positive psychological and sociocultural outcomes. Whereas marginalization, where you don't feel like you belong anywhere, is associated with the worst outcomes. So that's a little bit of information on ethnic identity development, and I want to head into a discussion about racial identity formation. And before I talk about that, I want to bring in this idea of equality and equity, which I believe is critical to understand as we talk about racial identity development. So I believe that this picture actually shows the definitions of equality and equity well. And let's say that there are three different people of different heights trying to view the baseball game. Now, you'll see that each of these different individuals, have a different height. And so some people are actually born with more height than others, but they all share the common goal of being able to see the baseball game. In the first image, this is the image of equality, and that's when everyone is assumed to benefit from giving them each the same amount of support, equal support. But as you can see, there's an issue with this because even with equal amount of box given to each individual, the shortest person still can't see. Okay, and even the middle person can only see but barely, right? And that's equality. Equity, on the other hand, is when you give different amounts of support depending on how much each person needs. Okay, and so because the tall person can already see, we're not going to give him a box, but the shortest person will give him 2 boxes and the medium-sized person will give him 1 box because that's the amount they actually need based off of the hand that they've been dealt with. Okay, and that's called equity. In an ideal world, you would see the third image where there wouldn't be any barriers to them seeing the game, and they would be able to see plainly no matter what height that they have. Okay, but in education, generally speaking, we're after equity. Everyone is different, and everyone will need different amounts of support, and all to see the same outcome of being able to see the game or being able to learn, being able to achieve, being able to be healthy. Okay. So with equity and equality, I want to bring in this idea of privilege because we really need to ask ourselves, are certain racial groups given more privilege than others? And this is one area that we might have different opinions, okay? But I do want to show you a video that I believe demonstrates that privilege can indeed exist.